Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to start our unit on behaviorism. And as a reminder, behaviorism is one of our perspectives of psychology that tries to explain why people think, feel, and act the way that they do. And you may recall that when we learned about behaviorism is going to argue that we think, feel, and act the way that we do because we have been conditioned over time to think, feel, and act that way. In other words, we've been taught or we've been trained to behave in certain ways. Some students get a little confused because remember, behaviorism as a perspective is not the same thing as behavior, as an action. Behaviorism tries to explain behavior through conditioning. Why do you behave the way that you do? Well, behaviorists would say it's because you've been trained to do that. And there are a few different kind of branches of behaviorism that we will explore throughout this unit. Today, we're going to focus specifically on classical conditioning. But before we get into classical conditioning, a real quick slide as we are considering why we act in certain ways. Sometimes the reason we act the way that we do is because of something internal, something genetic, something that we have inherited in order to behave a certain way. So, what I'm talking about here is reflexes and instincts. Now, reflexes we've already talked about in class. In psychology, a reflex is a physiological response to some particular stimuli that doesn't require cognition. Again, this is review from Unit 2. For example, if you touch something hot or if you step on something sharp, that information will travel up the afferent neurons or the sensory neurons in your arm or your leg or wherever it may be to the inner neurons in your spinal cord, and then a message will immediately be sent back down through efferent neurons or motor neurons, again in your arm or leg, wherever it is, to have a reflex to pull your arm back, to lift up your leg and your foot. These are physiological reflexes that don't require cognition, and we all have them. Instincts, kind of like reflexes, has a very specific definition in psychology. And we tend to use that word instinct differently in our everyday language. So, take for example, it's late at night, you're walking home from work, and there's this kind of dark alley. Well, you may think to yourself, my instincts are telling me I shouldn't walk down that alley. I'm going to go this other direction that's more public and there's more light over here because it seems safer. Well, although all of those things are true, that would not be an appropriate use of the psychological term of instinct. An instinct is something you're born with. An instinct is a set or series of behaviors put together that creates or accomplishes some goal. For example, baby turtles, I got that cute little picture there. Baby turtles are able to break their way out of their shell, crawl out of the sand, and then waddle their way down to the ocean where they'll likely get met with by a bunch of sharks and things. They're able to complete this series of behaviors, and no one teaches them to do it. They just know how to do it. Birds that are born in isolation, kept in isolation their entire life, are still able to build nests. They didn't witness a mother bird or father bird build a nest. They didn't watch any of their neighbor birds building nests. They are born knowing how to do this. I'm going to use the word complex loosely, but this kind of complex action of putting behaviors together. So that's what we refer to as an instinct. Now, there are people out there that would claim, using this definition, we as humans don't have any instincts. Like when we are born, what series of behaviors that we do all together to create and accomplish some goal? Well, I don't know if there is one, right? We have plenty of reflexes. There are lots of reflexes that we have at birth, but are there a series of behaviors that we put together to accomplish a goal? Maybe, maybe not. Some may argue, for example, that when a woman becomes pregnant, she kind of goes through this nesting period where they may be getting the nursery together and things like that. Is that an instinct? Perhaps we could debate that. But instincts for psychology think a series of behaviors put together to accomplish a goal. Lots of examples of that in the animal kingdom, maybe not so much for humans, but it's important that we can distinguish that from a learned behavior. If you avoid the dark alleyway when you're walking home, that's not something you're born with. That's not an instinct. That's something that you have been conditioned, that you have learned over time that could be a dangerous situation, so you should avoid it. So that's what we're going to focus on with behaviorism. Why do you behave certain ways? Because you've learned to behave in those ways. You've been conditioned over time. So let's go ahead and look at this idea of behaviorism. Our actions and thoughts are the result of being trained over time to behave a particular way, right? This nice kind of textbook definition. And we will have essentially 3 lectures or so that talk about the main types of behaviorism. I have them listed here: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. Today's lecture is just going to focus on classical. You don't even necessarily need to write that down. You can if you'd like, but you can think that's going to be the series of lectures you're going to see over the next week or so for the different types of behaviorism. So let's start with classical, and it all kind of began with this scientist named Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov, admittedly, was not a psychologist. Although he is known today for his contributions to psychology, he was a scientist, and he chose to study spit, which is interesting, but he studied the digestive system, and specifically, he worked on the digestive system with dogs. And so he would have in his lab all of these different dogs, and they were hooked up to these mechanisms where he inserted tubes into their salivatory glands. He would walk in, they'd have food, and as they would start to salivate, Pavlov could monitor the levels of saliva that these dogs were producing. Fascinating, right? But what he found was something really interesting started to occur. What he realized was the dogs would begin to salivate when he simply walked into the room. Now, many times when he came into the room, he was bringing food with them. And so it would be natural when you put the food in front of the dog that they would start to salivate. But sometimes he was just walking into the room to check on the dogs, to maybe check their harness and make sure that everything was okay, or to get something out of the lab, and the dogs would start to salivate. And so Pavlov recognized that these dogs were being conditioned. They've learned to associate his presence walking in the room with food. So classical conditioning is a type of what we call associative learning, where they are starting to associate stimuli, the stimulus of him, Ivan Pavlov, and the stimulus of food. They were starting to put these things together. The dogs were learning to have a response. And so he coins this idea of what we now call classical conditioning. And classical conditioning has several components to it. I'm going to tell you that as I go through this with you on this recorded lecture, it's going to just make sense, hopefully, where you're going to say, okay, yeah, I think I got it. But then when I stop and you just need to practice it on your own, it can be tricky. Students tend to traditionally kind of struggle knowing what goes where. So bear with me as we work through the process of classical conditioning, and hopefully when we're done, we can have some opportunities to put it to practice and see if it makes sense. So where does it start? Well, classical conditioning is going to start with what we call the unconditioned stimulus. This is sometimes abbreviated as UCS. Sometimes you'll see it just as US, unconditioned stimulus. And you need to break that phrase down into how it makes sense. So first of all, we'll start with the stimulus. It's going to be some kind of energy action that produces a response, right? A stimulus. But let's look at that word unconditioned. If the word conditioned is synonymous with training, then unconditioned, you can think of it as natural. It's going to happen naturally. So an unconditioned stimulus is going to be a stimulus that triggers a natural response. For example, food, right? Food is going to trigger a natural response, and in this case, it's going to be salivating. We'll get there in just a moment. So paired with that unconditioned stimulus is going to be our unconditioned response. It's going to be a response to that trigger. So a natural, unlearned response to the stimulus itself. You're going to salivate when you smell that food. It's unconditioned. That pairing is unconditioned, meaning no one has to teach you that, right? If I put a pepperoni pizza down right in front of you, you are going to start to salivate, and you never learned to salivate. It's just going to happen naturally. If there's a really loud bang, you're going to flinch, and no one's going to teach you to do that. It is an unconditioned stimulus, bang, a loud sound, and an unconditioned response of flinching. No one teaches you to do it. It happens in our natural world. Now, where does the conditioning take place? The conditioning takes place when we pair together our unconditioned stimulus, in this case food, with a conditioned stimulus, right? Conditioned means taught or learned. So we're going to pair together that food with some kind of unnatural stimulus. So what Pavlov started to do was he started to pair together, every time he gave the dogs food, he started to ring a bell. Well, a bell is not going to produce any particular response all on its own. So Pavlov is going to ring a bell every time he gives food to the dogs. And what's going to happen is that bell, over time, because it has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus, will start to produce what we call a conditioned response. The conditioned response, you will see, is going to look very similar to the unconditioned response. But now, why is the conditioned response happening? The conditioned response is happening as a result of the conditioned stimulus. So think about that for a moment. Before any learning took place, if Pavlov just walked up to a dog and rang a bell in its face, the dog would look at him saying, "What's the big deal? Why are you ringing a bell in my face?" But through conditioning, Pavlov would ring a bell, give him food, ring a bell, give him food, ring a bell, give him food. And over time, you could go up to the dog, you could ring a bell, and the dog begins to salivate. That's not natural. The dog had to learn to do that. The dog salivates to that bell because the bell has become a conditioned stimulus, and salivating to it is now the conditioned response. So, one more time, kind of a different way to view it. You can look at it as this kind of four-step process. Before conditioning, our food, the unconditioned stimulus, will produce salivation, the unconditioned response. Again, before conditioning, ringing a bell will not produce any particular response. The bell at the beginning is going to be what we call a neutral stimulus. Then this next step is what we call acquisition, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But acquisition is when you pair together the two stimuli. That is important to know. Acquisition is when you pair together the UCS with the CS, right? We're pairing together the UCS, the food, with what will become the CS, the conditioned stimulus. And at this point, you can still refer to it as a neutral stimulus because the bell isn't doing much. You pair them together over and over and over again. The response is salivation. Now, the response is salivation here because of the food. But if you do this enough times, what can happen is you can take that food away, and then after conditioning, the bell, which is now our conditioned stimulus, produces a conditioned response. That's a lot. You probably need to pause a few times to jot this down because we're talking about a lot of terms that look and sound very, very similar. So try to keep those organized in your brain. Because when we look at the grand scheme of things of how this works, you need to have an understanding of the different things happening in this chart, right? So if we look at our x-axis, for example, this is just time passing. If we look at our y-axis, the strength of the conditioned response. So you have to think, okay, well, what is the conditioned response? Let's stick with Pavlov. The conditioned response is salivating to the sound of a bell. That's the conditioned response, okay? Weak meaning it's not likely to happen at all. Strong, it's definitely going to happen. So in this first stage, the acquisition stage, you will notice that we are pairing together the neutral stimulus, which is the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. As you pair those things together during acquisition, the strength of the conditioned response, the strength of the salivating to the bell, will continue to increase and become stronger. This vertical dotted line represents when you take the unconditioned stimulus away. So at that vertical dotted line, that was the first time that Pavlov rings the bell but doesn't give food. And you'll notice that starting with that time, the strength of the conditioned response will go down. Because if he rings the bell and doesn't give food, The dog is going to salivate. But if he does it again, the dog's thinking, where's my food? And if Pavlov keeps ringing that bell without presenting food, then over time, what's going to happen is that conditioned response is going to go away. And that's the process of extinction. When the conditioned response goes away, we say that is extinction. Then what can happen is time may pass, and then we have what's called spontaneous recovery. And spontaneous recovery is when all of a sudden that conditioned response comes back. And all of a sudden you have this learned response to a particular stimuli. So I'm going to keep this up on the screen. I'm going to give you another example. Okay. Imagine for a moment that you go to, let's say you go to Taco Bell and you order a chalupa. And you eat your chalupa, and then you get home and you get physically ill and you throw up all over the place. Okay. After that, every time you see the Taco Bell sign, you feel really, really nauseous. You feel sick to your stomach. Let's think about the different components here and see if you can follow along with me. The unconditioned stimulus is food poisoning. The unconditioned response is getting physically sick. You don't need to teach anyone that. That's going to happen naturally. If someone eats food that is bad and then they get physically ill, that's not learned. That happens naturally. It's unconditioned. Now, what have we paired together? We have paired together the stimuli, the unconditioned stimulus of the chalupa that's gone bad, and a conditioned stimulus, just looking at Taco Bell. And what's happened is just looking at Taco Bell, looking at the sign on the billboard, produces a conditioned response where you feel sick. But if you drive by that Taco Bell every day when you go to Park Hill or when you go to work, then over time what's going to happen is it's just going to be the conditioned stimulus alone. If you look in this middle part, it's just the sign without the chalupa. And over time, you can see the sign over and over and over again without physically getting sick, without the conditioned response. And so the conditioned response might go away. A year later, you might be able to see that sign and not feel sick to your stomach. We would say your conditioned response is gone. You no longer feel nauseous by looking at a Taco Bell sign. But then a month or two goes by, you're driving to work, you're driving to school, you look up, you see the Taco Bell sign, and you're like, ugh, I feel sick. We would say that's spontaneous recovery. All of a sudden, that conditioned response of feeling nauseous to the conditioned stimulus, the Taco Bell sign, has returned. You look at that sign, you think, oh, I feel sick, right? So think about these different components of classical conditioning. I want to introduce to you who we refer to as the father of behaviorism. His name was John Watson. Although Ivan Pavlov kind of stumbled across classical conditioning, remember, he was not a self-proclaimed psychologist. It was John Watson who took the understandings of Ivan Pavlov and really embraced it. Watson is the father of behaviorism. I love this quote. I'll let you kind of look at this quote that I have up on the screen. It's one of my favorite quotes for behaviorism. I want you to think about it for a moment. Watson, he's saying, if you allow me to take any baby at random and raise them in my own specified lab, I can turn them into anything you want, right? He was a true behaviorist. He believed that whatever we thought, whatever we felt, whatever we did was the result of being conditioned. And so if you want a doctor, I will train this baby to be a doctor, and they will be a doctor. They won't want to play basketball because they won't even know basketball exists. So it's the idea of true behaviorism. So what did he do? He started rounding up a bunch of orphans, not to turn them into thieves and things like that. Instead, he had this really kind of what is now considered quite unethical experiment in psychology. It's what we call the Little Albert experiment. And so what happened was this. Before conditioning, John Watson would take this cute little 8-9-month-old infant known as Albert, and he would present Albert with lots of different stimuli. For example, he'd give little Albert this little white lab rat, this cute furry lab rat, and little Albert was just fine, and the rat would crawl around in its lap, and there was no problem at all. That NS, it's a neutral stimulus. This rat causes no particular response. Then what John Watson would do is he'd make a really loud noise. He would take a hammer and a piece of metal and he'd smash them together and it'd create this really loud noise. And little Albert would freak out. He'd start crying. Well, little Albert wasn't taught to cry to that loud noise. It was unconditioned, right? The loud noise is what we call the unconditioned stimulus, and the fear was the unconditioned response. It was frightening to Albert. He didn't need to be taught that. It was natural to him. Well, you might be able to see where this is going. So what John Watson did next was he started to pair together the stimuli. You can see the stimuli on the screen. The neutral stimulus of the rat, the unconditioned stimulus of the loud noise. And so John Watson would pair them together. He'd give him the white rat, and then he'd make this really loud sound, and the result was little Albert would be afraid. This was the acquisition stage. He gives him the rat, plays the sound. Gives him the rat, plays the sound. And it's important that he does it in that particular order. When you're thinking about classical conditioning, you want to present the unconditioned stimulus after the neutral stimulus, because it's all about anticipation, right? If you think about Pavlov and his dogs, you ring the bell and then you give them food, because you want the bell to then represent what is coming next. So through acquisition, John Watson would give little Albert the white rat and then make this really loud noise. Little Albert would cry and be afraid. He'd take the rat away. We'd wait 10 minutes till little Albert calmed down. Then he'd do it again and again and again and again and again. And then eventually conditioning took place where John Watson would put the rat in front of little Albert, and sure enough, little Albert gets upset. Little Albert has learned to be afraid of the rat that before conditioning did not result in any particular response. Now the neutral stimulus, the rat, has become a conditioned stimulus. And I didn't change it here, but that NS, the neutral stimulus, has become a CS, a conditioned stimulus. And little Albert has become afraid of the rat. And so you ask yourself, well, why the heck did he do this? We already knew this would happen. Like Pavlov told us this would happen. Well, we talk about John Watson because it taught us a couple new things about conditioning. It talked about, or we learned from it, these two last terms for this lecture, what we call generalization and discrimination. I want you to think about how the conditioned stimuli produces a conditioned response. In some instances, it is multiple conditioned stimuli that will produce a conditioned response. For example, little Albert was not just afraid of white rats. It turns out that after conditioning, little Albert was also afraid of bunny rabbits and puppy dogs, and there's even video of John Watson putting on a white fluffy Santa Claus's beard and little Albert freaking out. So little Albert was afraid of like all white furry things. Little Albert generalized the conditioned stimulus. So lots of different conditioned stimuli all produced that particular response. Maybe after eating the nasty chalupa, all Taco Bell makes you feel nauseous. Everything on the menu makes you feel sick. Even the grilled stuffed burrito, which is delicious, makes you feel sick. If that's the case, that's what we call generalization. My dogs go crazy anytime anything that sounds remotely like our doorbell rings. It can be a cell phone ringing, and the dogs think someone's at the front door. They've generalized there are multiple conditioned stimuli. Discrimination, on the other hand, is when there is only one specific conditioned stimulus that produces a conditioned response. Just one. So maybe you feel sick thinking about the chalupa, but if you're going to go get a steak quesadilla, you're good, right? If there's only one conditioned stimulus that produces a response, that's what we call discrimination. I have the picture of the clock up there. So we have these intercom systems in our building, and you're conditioned to what the sound is when the bell rings to dismiss you from class or dismiss you to go home. But even if those exact same speakers produce a slightly different tone, and that is the front office or the nurse's office or the counselor's office, whoever ringing into my room to ask for a student, well, you have learned, you've been conditioned that that sound does not dismiss you from class. Similar sound coming from the same speakers, but you have discriminated against those different stimuli. So generalization, multiple stimuli produces one your conditioned response. Discrimination, one stimulus produces the response. So there's quite a bit there with a lot of different terms. It's not uncommon for students to feel pretty comfortable after this lecture and claim they've got it, they understand classical conditioning, and then I give students examples and they struggle to kind of figure it out. So look over your notes, email me with questions that you might have, and best of luck, everyone.